Senator Seward.
Chair, I have a series of questions that I would like some information around that pertain to the amendments that have been moved. The amendments that have been moved are largely in a response to the comprehensive dissenting report or additional comments report, that the Greens submitted during the committee process, during the Community Affairs Committee process. I'm pleased to see these amendments. In fact, as I indicated in my second reading speech, the Greens would not be supporting this legislation unless these amendments or significant improvements were made. These amendments do improve the bill to the point where we can support it, but we need some answers to some questions first. I would also like to just correct a few of the misconceptions that, if anyone was listening to the second reading debate, would have taken away from that, particularly listening to some of the coalition senators' contributions, and that was that this legislation isn't supported by the not-for-profit sector. Now, while the not-for-profit sector has a number of concerns, or had a number of concerns, a lot of the concerns that were canvassed through the debate were in fact about the exposure draft and the first version of the bill that have subsequently been quite a bit amended in response to the community input. And I'd like to point out here that one of the reasons that we have a committee process is so that the Senate and the House of Reps, when they look at bills, can look at what are the flaws in a bill and make amendments. Otherwise, why do we bother with committee process? We have a committee process to do due diligence to look at legislation. That's exactly what happened to this legislation. And lo and behold, the government actually listened to a committee and made the amendments. So I, for one, think that's a really good process, and I'm really glad to see our democracy operating in that way. So I had a contribution from Uniting Care, because Uniting Care, I will hope my voice holds out for the rest of this debate. Uniting Care contributed, as did a number of other community and charity not-for-profits, contributed substantively to the 3 committee inquiries that were held into this suite of legislation. And their name was a bit taken in vain, they felt, during the debate on Monday night, because they said that Uniting Care raised some points of concern, and they in fact did through the initial process. But I'd like to read an email that I do have permission to read in response to some of the taking the Uniting Care's name in vain. And this is from their CEO, Lynn Hatfield-Dodds, the CEO of Uniting Care Australia. She said these quotes, and these are the quotes that were used during the debate, these quotes are in relation to the draft bill which appeared before the Standing Economics Committee. Since that time, there have been 2 other committees, a series of amendments made to the bills and associated legislation, and 2 key commitments from the government to the anti-gag clauses and the red tape reduction that have secured our support for this bill as it stands before the Senate. This legislation is more than simply the establishment of a new national regulator for the sector. It is recognition of that our sector has come of age, a sector which is not an arm of government nor a subset of the business sector, but one which has its own identity defined by its altruistic mission and characterised by its diversity and independence. The introduction of this bill, together with the introduction of an anti-gag clause legislation and amendments to the Commonwealth Grants Guidelines, are important to securing a robust and independent sector. It is important that governments legislate its anti-gag clause arrangements and implement its proposed changes to the Commonwealth Grant Guidelines to address some of the outstanding red tape issues and enshrine the capacity of community service organisations to do advocacy. Help us get on with our mission, Australian Parliament, and support this bill. Now, as I said, I have permission to read that quote. That's exactly what I've been trying to do in terms of actively engaging with this piece of legislation to try and achieve change and to reflect the comments of civil society and the not-for-profit and charity sector to try and improve this bill. And with this aim, I would like to start my series of questions, if that is the will of the chamber. And in particular, I'd like to start where Lynn Hatfield-Dodds was talking about the gag clauses, and in particular point out again that, as I articulated in my second reading speech, the independence of the sector is very important to the sector, and it's something that the Greens hold very dear as well. So we were particularly keen to see the government respond to that with its amendment that was passed in the House of Representatives, but they've since gone further with the anti-gag clauses legislation, which we are pleased to see. And this is particularly important because the government has a monopoly. I find that difficult to say in the first place without having a poor voice, a monopoly over funding arrangements. Can you say that, Senator Conroy? Over funding arrangements. In other words, they're often the sole contractor, the sole funder, which means it gives them an imbalance in power in negotiating contract arrangements. And we've seen that abused in the past with gag clauses in contracts, and we don't want to go back to the bad old days. So this particular piece of legislation is very important. So what I'd like to ask the minister is, can the minister please provide us with a timetable for the introduction of that promised legislation? And can the minister please demonstrate how it has engaged or intends to engage the not-for-profit sector in drafting this legislation to ensure that it is significantly robust to provide the reassurance that the sector is looking for in terms of gag clauses, and that they will no longer be included in the Commonwealth funding arrangements?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. On the 17th of September, the government announced that it would introduce legislation to ban gag clauses in Commonwealth contracts with the not-for-profit sector, ensuring ongoing positive engagement and open debate between the government and the not-for-profit sector. The government recognises that a strong, independent and innovative MFP sector is essential to provide an inclusive community. In contrast to this, the Howard government tried to silence the not-for-profit sector through gag clauses. The great doyens of freedom of speech, as they always pretend they are, Senator, as they always pretend they are, wanted to gag charities. Gag charities. So they tried to muzzle the independent voice of the not-for-profit sector, and it took the election of a Labor government to act to remove these insulting gag clauses in 2008. We're now seeing a rerun. We're seeing Premier Newman doing the same in Queensland, gagging charities. You guys, you pretenders of protection of free speech, gagging charities because they might disagree with what you're doing. It's just a disgrace, and you should be ashamed of yourself. You pretend in this chamber to be a great, great supporter of free speech. The great defenders of free speech, you're actually been gagging charities. You've actually passed laws to gag people. Don't you stand up in here and try and pretend remotely. You're a disgrace, absolute disgrace. Are you in Collingwood outfit again? Good, you're in the Collingwood outfit again. You can keep interjecting. Oh, look. When we get.
Order. Let's get back to answering Senator Seawart's question.
Exactly. When we get to debate the bill, you can try and pretend that the bill is about gagging the media. What you won't be able to hide from is the fact that you gag charities with legislation. You did it. We undid it. The Greens supported it being undone. You did it. And now Premier Newman is doing it again. So everybody knows that if the coalition was to win government again nationally, you'd put those gags back in place. You would put those gags back in place. It is part of your DNA. You can't help it. It is in your political DNA because you want to gag charities. The government has announced that it will introduce legislation to ban gag clauses in Commonwealth contracts with the not-for-profit sector because we respect the independence of the sector. The government is currently progressing the preparation of legislation to ban these gag clauses. We are firmly committed to its delivery. Targeted consultation with stakeholders on the legislation is planned to take place during early December. The government will be introducing legislation in the first sitting weeks of 2013 with a view to prompt passage through the parliament.
Senator Siewert.
One other question there, and that is where, and this will apply to Commonwealth funding arrangements, where there's joint agreements between states and Commonwealths, will this also then be able to, is it the intent that the legislation would also apply where there's a joint Commonwealth state agreement? So in other words, any of those, that funding that is made available through those joint agreements, could this legislation also imply to ensure that states can't use that funding and impose gag clauses?
Senator Connery.
We'll need to get some further detailed advice for you, Senator, but we intend for this to reach as far as we can.
Senator Siewert.
I thank the Minister for his answer, and I would appreciate any further information, because obviously there's a lot of funding that is delivered, and this came up in estimates the week before last when I was, in fact, canvassing some of the issues around the next bill that we'll be debating in this chamber, the community equity pay issues, that there are a lot of agreements that funding is delivered through a joint agreements. So being able to deal with that through this legislation, to be able to do that, that would give us and the sector a great deal of reassurance. So that would be appreciated. Perhaps I could. I'm aware of time, so I am undertaking to try and move through these as expeditiously as possible. The volunteer individual directors issue was raised a lot during the various committee inquiries, and we flagged it in our in our additional comment report. Many of the organisations, as we have been discussing in the Chamber's second reading contributions, many organisations have few, if any, staff, and they rely heavily on volunteers to run their organisations. And I note the comments from World Vision Australia during the Senate inquiry that it is well accepted that non-compliance is usually a matter of ignorance or under-resourcing. In light of these comments, the Australian Greens would expect that the Commissioner would take an active role, in fact. That's what we understand from discussions in the various committees, in educating registered organisations about their obligations and ensuring that volunteer directors have easy access to plain English explanations of their duties and responsibilities under the Act and how to perform. Can you tell us how the Commissioner will support and educate volunteer directors, and what safeguards the government has put in place through the legislation to ensure that volunteer directors are aware of their obligations?
Minister.
The government recognises and values the vital contribution made by volunteers and volunteer directors to the not-for-profit sector. We want to encourage them to continue to make an important contribution to Australian charities and not-for-profits. As part of its role, the ACNC will provide education and guidance to relevant responsible entities, including volunteer directors of unincorporated associations, to assist them to meet the requirements under the bill. This is consistent with the ANC Commissioner's general approach of resolving compliance issues primarily through education and guidance, rather than using heavy-handed enforcement powers. This regulatory approach is outlined in the ACNC's implementation report released in June 2012. In addition, as part of the development of the ACNC regulatory framework's governance standards, the government will also be seeking input and feedback on the possibility of additional protections for volunteer directors of registered entities.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for his answer. Yeah. In terms of the review process, and this is going to be an area of ongoing concern, I'm pretty certain, and we are aware that there are already provisions to allow the Commissioner to have regard to the size and nature of organisations, and the Australian Greens expect the Commissioner to consider whether the directors have acted in good faith and the extent to which compliance issues can be resolved through education, particularly with volunteer directors and unincorporated organisations. However, we do have concerns about the extent to which the directors of unincorporated entities are exposed to legal liability on behalf of an entity under this legislation. What assurances can Minister you provide that the ACNC's approach to dealing with these issues what approach will the ACNC take to dealing with these issues that involve volunteer directors, and also there's going to be a review process in around the assessment of the impact. With the review process, will that include an assessment of the impact of the ACNC arrangements have had on entities that are run by volunteers, particularly the impact on the ability of organisations to recruit volunteer directors? Because that's one of the points that came up through the inquiries, is that this will put off people wanting to be volunteer to be on these organisations.
Minister.
Thanks. Look, this is obviously an issue where, because we're stepping into a new jurisdiction, the culture of the organisation, the Commissioner, the ACNC, is vital. The government's view is that it is vital that the Commissioner follow through with the education and training aspect long before any other action is needed. We would be concerned if the first step was enforcement action. We think this would lead to a culture that you're describing. So we would only envisage that these powers will be needed in the most extreme examples of misbehaviour. So I think we're right to be cautious. We're right to ask these questions. The culture of the agency is very, very important. But we do not believe that there should be, a first step. It needs to be the last resort in the most extreme circumstances.
Senator Siewert.
I thank the Minister for his answer, and as I said, I know this is an issue that is exercising the minds of a number of people. Could I bring him, perhaps bring his attention to the second part of my question, which was about is there a commitment that the impact of this legislation, a review of any potential or any impact that's been had on the ability of organisations to attract volunteer directors and on the functioning of organisations? Can I just go to that second part of the question?
Minister.
I advise that the government will continually review the impact of this legislation, including as to how it impacts on volunteer directors. We've swapped, Senator Siewert, and I come a little unprepared. I apologise for that. I hadn't realised Senator Connell was doing this, was leaving.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. Perhaps if I appreciate the answer that there'll be a continued review rather than a review of the overall review of the legislation, would that be something that the Commissioner might be able to include, therefore, in their report to the Parliament that that the Commissioner will make annually?
Minister.
We can ask the Commissioner to consider that.
Senator Siewert. That
would be very much appreciated. Thank you. Perhaps I could move on to the objects, and that relates to the ACNC Commissioner upholding the objects of the legislation of the Commission. Sorry. We heard in the Senate inquiry that the ACNC Commissioner should be given specific responsibility for upholding the objects of the Act and advising the Minister on its implementation in the text or in the bill. Could the Government and the Minister please confirm the Commissioner will uphold the objects of the Act? And could you please explain how the Minister will do this and what resources will be made available for them to do that?
Minister.
I'm advised the Commissioner does have responsibility for upholding the objects of the Act, and the report to Parliament will include an assessment of how the Commissioner has promoted the objects of the Act, including the reduction of unnecessary regulatory obligations. My recollection is there is a provision in the budget for this reform, Senator, but I might have to take on notice the details of that at this point. Yep.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. There had been, I'll just clarify that and thank the Minister for the answer. There was continual discussion around whether the bill defined enough the objects that the Commissioner was responsible for upholding the Act, so I very much appreciate that clarification. Could I please then go on to issues around basic religious charities? Basic religious charities are recognised as complex entities that have evolved over time in a way that is different to other not-for-profit organisations, and they've been given some special status in this bill. As a result, they have some different reporting thresholds and responsibilities applied to this type of entity. The Australian Guild and some issues were raised during the committee's inquiries. The Australian Greens are still concerned that these arrangements may not provide sufficient requirements to ensure the accountability and transparency and hence maintain public trust and confidence in these organisations. The amendments introduced in the House of Representatives even further relaxed the non-financial reporting thresholds for basic religious entities that operate for schools. While we didn't seek to, during this stage, to seek to amend the legislation in this regard, we would like a commitment that these thresholds be reviewed. When the legislation is reviewed, we would like a commitment that these thresholds will be included as part of that review.
Minister.
We will. First, as part of establishing the Commission in consultation with stakeholders, the government has decided to provide a targeted exemption for basic religious charities, and I think the Senator referred to this. Practical effect is to exempt certain unincorporated religious entities from a number of requirements under legislation. We do believe the exemption is appropriate. As with all elements of legislation, it will examine its effectiveness of the exemption as part of the 5-year statutory review of the legislation.
Senator Siewert.
I thank the Minister for the answer, and I have a similar one in terms of the thresholds for small, medium and large entities. This was another point of very significant debate during the various committee inquiries as to whether those sizes were appropriate, and particularly the over $1 million. You've got a number of organisations that are just over $1 million and some that are hundreds of millions of dollars. And that group seems, very wide. And same with small organisations. There's some concern that the definition between small and medium organisations. Now, when I then subsequently looked into it and talked to various organisations, I didn't hear any better examples. Any other examples that were raised also raised their own issues. So I was persuaded to the argument that it's best to see how it runs for the time being and then maybe amend it into the future. So again, I'm seeking a commitment that specifically that issue will be specifically looked into as part of the review process after the review of the operation of the Act.
Minister.
Yes, I'm advised that is the case. There's no carve-out, as I understand it, for the statutory review, and the thresholds would therefore fall within its purview. I'd also refer to the Senator to, I think, page 3 of the revised EM, which sets out the financial impact of the establishment of the ACNC.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. During the committee inquiry, there was an issue raised about the inconsistency within the EM around regards to the role of the ACNC board. And could you please clarify how the board will operate and under what conditions it will be able to offer advice to the commissioner? And can the minister expand on the makeup of the board, how the participants will be selected, how the board will ensure that its membership includes individuals with strong experience in operating not-for-profit organisations? Just to elaborate that a little bit more, during the Senate inquiry, the issues about the board only being able to provide advice on request, and then there seemed to be another element of the legislation that conflicted with that and seemed to not quite rely on the concept of the board only providing advice when requested, and I just seek clarification so they're really clear on that particular point.
Minister.
I understand first the intention is that the advisory board be appropriately representative of the sector. It is the case, however, in the EM that the board, on page 171, Senator, it's not envisaged that the board would provide advice that's not in response to a request from the Commissioner. Sorry, if you look at page 171, it does indicate the board, it's not intended that the board would provide advice that is not in a response to a request from a Commissioner. That question. But I'm advised the Commissioner has indicated that they would be actively seeking the board's advice.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. I did understand that that was what the bill said, but because of that particular issues raised during the committee, I was seeking clarification. So it is the intent that despite any other contradictions, it's only can provide advice upon request.
Minister.
That is what the legislation provides, Senator. But as we said, I think in practice, this is unlikely to become a significant issue if the Commissioner is genuinely going to be seeking the advice of the board on appropriate matters. They've obviously got the opportunity to provide that.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. What's the timeline for the establishment of the board? And you partially answered the question in terms of members with expertise with the not-for-profit sector on the board. What's the timeline for the establishment of the board?
Minister.
I suspect this is going to be one of the in the near future answers, Senator Siewert. But I'm advised we are that work is underway. So we would anticipate being able to do so in the near future.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. Does it near future mean by Christmas or?
Minister.
I said do our best.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. There was quite a bit of debate during the Senate inquiries and out there in the not-for-profit land around the governance standards, and I'm pleased and very, very pleased about the amendments that the amendments that have been planned in terms of the way the regulation process will operate. It didn't go as far as we'd like, which is we wanted the process in the legislation. As I articulated during my second reading contribution, I understand the reasons why that can't happen in terms of time frame, because it's a very complex issue. But these are a critical part of the functioning of this Act, and I'm particularly pleased that that section that gave the Commission the power to direct an entity to act or not act in a specific manner has been taken out, because that went to the very heart of the independence of the sector. However, I would like to ask a couple of questions in terms of the consultation process. It's an area that we paid particular attention to, and another amendment that I'm particularly pleased to see is the inclusion of the consultation process, and further the inclusion of the Commissioner's role in the consultation process. But I would like to just tease out here and get a confirmation about who will actually be the lead in the consultation process over the governance standards. Will it be the Commissioner? Will it be Treasurer or the Minister? I understand the Minister. I do understand the process. The Minister is the final decision maker. But from our perspective, it's important that the Commission takes a very active role in this consultation process, and that's a clear message that I've received from the sector. They want to be dealing with the Commission. That's why they support a Commission, is because they see the Commission as the body that will now be helping to look after them and in helping them become a strong, or to enhance their vibrancy and their independence.
Minister.
Well, first 2 points. Obviously, it's our intention that the Commission, or our understanding the Commission, will take an active role in consultation, and that the Minister will be seeking the Commission's advice. Senator
Siewert.
With all due respects, that didn't answer the question in terms of I'm glad the government will be seeking the Commission's advice, but how strongly will the Commission be a lead in these discussions, and also what resourcing will be available for them to undertake that consultation? And a supplementary to that one is, will there be resources for the not-for-profit sector to be able to engage in this? This is going to be a really heavy-duty process. These go to the very heart of the operation of this Commission and how it relates to the not-for-profit charities sector. So it's vital that this particular process happens appropriately.
Minister.
Senator, as I understand, under the legislation, it is the Minister who consults, but obviously that's not unusual, an unusual statutory provision, and my first answer does stand, which is we'd envisage an active role by the Commissioner in that consultation, as well as, I assume, officers of the Treasury in that process. I mean, it's a little, I don't quite understand the lead concept, to be honest. So I can just speak to you or we would often have a consultation process where you'd have a number of levels of consultation. That's not unusual. You might have ministerial, you might have different levels of the public service in any consultation process. It's not intended as part of this legislation that there be any additional resources. I'm sure that you will tell me why we should do that, but it's not intended. We obviously, we've made some various decisions about, for example, as you would know, through supplementation for SACs and so forth for some parts of the not-for-profit sector, but that's for a different process.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. Maybe I need to be more blunt. The sector don't want Treasury determining or having that. They want to see the commissioner whose objects are, whose role is to support the objects of this legislation. One of which is the independence, vibrant sector, cutting red tape, and public trust and confidence. And they have more trust in an organisation that's coming from the perspective of understanding the sector rather than Treasury. So, I'll just cut straight to the chase and say that's the reason they want it. And quite frankly, some of the iterations of this legislation that we've seen has been because there hasn't been an understanding of the sector. And I'm not having a go at Treasury, and I'm not having a go at the ATO. They've got their jobs to do, but the Commission will bring an understanding and a relationship with the sector that those government departments just don't have. That's what we're looking for, is an ability to be able to negotiate and work with the sector.
Minister.
Thank you. Thank you for being blunt. Now I understand. I would say to you it is in the government's interests to ensure a proper consultation process and to ensure that the Commissioner is actively involved in that. I understand the Commissioner, Ms Pascoe, is a well-regarded individual by the not-for-profit sector, and to ensure an appropriate consultation process. I don't have any doubt that the Commissioner will be engaged. If there are issues down the track, Senator, which are raised with you, you do have the option, obviously, of making sure that the relevant minister is aware of that. I should probably defend the Department of the Treasury as well, who actively consult many members of the community across a whole wide range of issues. But I appreciate what you're saying. The sector want to have somebody who's really engaged with their issues as part of this process, and we would envisage that would occur.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you very much. And I'm wondering, and I have been asked to look at, how's this concept? People are really engaging with now. Once the bill's in place, how the governance process standards process is going to roll out and the consultation process. I realise that you can't preempt something that the Commissioner will undertake, but I'm wondering if it's possible that there could be an undertaking that before the consultation starts, that the development of the consultation process is discussed with the board or broadly with the not-for-profit sector, so that there's not a misunderstanding from the start about how that consultation process will occur.
Minister.
Well, I'm advised that the consultation is already starting, is what I've been told, and that the NFP Reform Council has been engaged. But you're wanting an indication about the board's involvement in structuring that. Is that right? Board's involvement in that. What was that? Well, the board's not yet been appointed, obviously, but perhaps we can deal with it this way, that we will ensure that the board is involved in consideration of the consultation process.
Senator Xenophon.
Thank you, Mr Acting Chair. I have a series of questions, and this follows on from my spectacularly unsuccessful second reading amendment, which I think I was the only voice supporting, but where I called on the government to introduce legislation detailing a definition of charities and charitable purposes and including a public benefit test within 12 months of the passage of these bills. So following on from that, can the Minister provide any information on when legislation relating to the definition of charity and charitable purpose will be introduced, and will this contain a public benefit test? And by way of background, the position in the United Kingdom, which I think is the benchmark for accountability for charities, something that has been tried and proven and worked well with the charities and not-for-profit sector, has included these definitions for a number of years. So my question is, I support the broad intent of this legislation. When will we go further in terms of a definition of charity and charitable purpose, and will it include a public benefit test?
Minister.
As I understand it, the government's committed to introduce legislation to provide for a statutory definition of charities by 1st of July 2013. Obviously, legislation will be introduced prior to that date, Senator. That would be anticipated. And I'm not in a position to give you any public indication of the content of that at this stage.
Senator Xenophon.
In the terms you've sought.
Minister.
Does the government acknowledge, will the government be looking, for instance, or what consultation process will there be as part of that, in broad terms? Doesn't need to be too Minister doesn't have to be too prescriptive, but does the government acknowledge that in the United Kingdom there is a definition of the public benefit that has been usefully used for a number of years?
Minister.
We would anticipate a public consultation process, Senator, so obviously people would be able to raise the issues such as public benefit that you've raised.
Senator Xenophon.
Does the Minister have a timeline for extending the Commission's responsibilities to NFPs, in other words, going beyond the scope of this legislation, and what further consultation will take place before this happens?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, the framework we're discussing is focused on charities. The government's intention is that the ACNC be able to fulfil the responsibilities it currently has in the legislation before considering any expansion to other not-for-profits. As a matter of logistics, the earliest point that other not-for-profits could be included in the regulatory framework would be 2014. However, it would be premature to make any decision regarding this, as we first want the Commission to be up and running and focused on charities and doing an effective job in that regard.
Hang on. Senator Xenophon.
Sorry, I jumped the gun there, Acting Chair. My final question to the Minister in relation to these preliminary matters. Can the Minister clarify concerns that have been expressed in relation to the responsibility of board members where charities have been found guilty of non-compliant actions? I note some of my colleagues, I think Senator McKenzie, I heard her considered contribution yesterday, talked about concerns raised by Mr Gonski about sanctions for non-compliance amongst directors being more onerous than the for-profit sector. I did read into the Hansard in my contribution what Mr Gonski said just last month, that he was reasonably satisfied with the revisions. But just given that this was, I think, a legitimate concern that was raised, can the government clarify that what has previously been raised as a concern is no longer the case in terms of the proposed framework of this piece of legislation?
Minister.
The provisions of the legislation governing obligations, liabilities and offences of incorporated and unincorporated entities have been redrafted, I'm advised, consistent with the recommendations of the House of Representatives Standing Committee inquiry. Criminal liabilities for directors of incorporated charities have been removed completely. The bill also now makes clear that where there is a non-criminal contravention of the bill, the director of an incorporated charity is only liable for any amount payable by the body corporate where this arises from a deliberate act or omission of the director involving dishonesty, gross negligence or recklessness. I'm also advised the director liability regime in the bill is not onerous when compared to other Commonwealth Acts. For example, the bill imposes no personal criminal liability on directors at all, whereas the Corporations Act imposes personal criminal liability in certain situations. For example, breaches of directors' duties, which may result in penalties of up to $220,000 or imprisonment for 5 years, or both. There are also references in the advice I've got to similar types of provisions in the tax laws, which are obviously more onerous than the bill before the chamber.
Senator Siewert.
Senator Xenophon, you touched on an area that I wanted to follow-up, which is about the extension of this to other entities. And you've already answered the first part of the question I was going to ask. But I'm wondering, you were sort of, Minister, you were sort of a bit vague about the plan is to do it in 2014. But that, do I take from your other subsequent comments, was that if that timeline isn't a set timeline, it may depend on how the issues are, how the Act is being implemented with the existing entities?
Minister.
I think I said the earliest would be, didn't I? Is that what you mean by vague? Yeah, so I don't think that indicated a specific commitment to a date, rather that in terms of the progress of this reform, that would be the earliest time at which it could be introduced. They're nodding, so I think I got that right.
Senator Seward.
Thank you. Is this part of the discussions through COAG as part of the harmonisation process? Is this the extension to the broader range of entities part of that consultation and discussion process, or is it completely separate?
Minister.
Senator, sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question. Were you asking if this was part of an existing consultation process?
Senator Seward.
There is a consultation process being undertaken at the moment, which is the harmonisation process. I'm wondering, as part of that harmonisation process, whether this is part of that discussion.
Minister.
Not part of the current process, but obviously, were there to be any extension, that would be the subject of consultation with states and territories.
Senator Seward.
Thank you for that clarification. I'd like to move on to red tape. This was it was a major issue, and the sector's been following it up very strongly, and about wanting to cut down on red tape and whether this is going to increase it. And I'm pleased to see that there's been more clarification in the bill. But I still have a couple of questions that I'd like to just follow up, please, and get on the record. The ACNC establishes a timeline for reducing unnecessary regulatory obligations on the Australian not-for-profit sector, and I'm pleased that the sector will now be, as part of its annual report, it will be detailing its progress against the timeline and in reducing red tape. However, the red tape issues are broader than those that are just, unfortunately, broader than those that are just under the influence of the ACNC. And while the ACNC has been given the task of promoting greater integration and fewer reporting requirements, the government as a whole has set forth its commitments to the sector and have an ongoing regard to delivery on that commitment. While the government has committed to ensuring that an independent regulatory impact assessment is undertaken and will the government also commit to ensuring that an independent regulatory impact assessment is undertaken and factor in the cost of compliance with the ACNC into its regulatory calculator?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm a little unclear about, in relation to which reform you want a regulation impact statement. What I can say to you is that the government has a very clear framework which applies across government decisions around the need to do a regulation impact assessment, which will look at the costs and the benefits of particular policy decisions, and that is the case in this area and across areas of policy, all areas of government. That where appropriate or where required under the framework that an RI, a RIS, Regulation Impact Statement, which incorporates the assessment, has to be part of the decision-making process. So I wasn't clear in your question, Senator, what reform you were saying should have a RIS.
Senator Seward.
Thank you, Chair. Into the regulatory calculator, will a compliance, the cost of compliance with the ACNC process be factored into that process?
Minister.
We have a very clear set of requirements under our regulatory assessment process, and the costs of compliance of whichever entity, from memory, is part of that assessment process. So we don't. Just check, well, we don't differentiate whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit. You still have to look at the costs of compliance.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. During the inquiry, as I'm sure many on that side of the chamber will be aware, is that there was various opportunities looked at for red tape reduction, and one of the proposals that was traversed was the Section 10, Schedule 1 of the Transition Bill, which states that the Commissioner may treat a statement or report given to another agency as an information statement or financial statement. Now, during the assessment process, the inquiry process, the Bishops' Council suggested that the government should amend the statement to read "the Commissioner will," and argued that this arrangement would protect organisations from unnecessary duplication as a result of the ACNC registration, until other arrangements can be resolved. Now, we agree, and the government did respond to that, and I do partly accept the government's concern that taking this step to amend the text of the bill to replace "made with will" could have unintended consequences. But for all that, for all government departments, there is no reason why this couldn't be used as a standard until either two other arrangements are instituted, or perhaps on a case-by-case, or perhaps put in place for a short-term process to see how it in fact could operate. Could the Minister explain, please, how the process of helping this to happen has been incorporated into the bill and other provisions, and how the implementation of the bill, to give effect to the concept, even if you can't change and amend the bill from "may" to "will"? It's the intent that we're looking for. So is it possible if you just explain, we're seeking a commitment of goodwill that until some of these other measures are put in place, that all the harmonisation processes are achieved, that in fact there will be used every intent to, for all intents and purposes, replace "may" with "will," even if it's not in the bill? Am I making myself clear there in terms of what we're looking for as a commitment that in fact that there will minimise, still maintaining transparency and accountability, but every intent will be made in this transition process to ensure that reports are, in fact, as the government has said, done once, used often?
Minister.
Senator, I think that the difficulty I have with one of the implications behind the question, and it may not be the intention, is that the suggestion that the Commissioner wouldn't do the right thing. Yeah. So I mean, my view is, is that, and the government's view is, it is appropriate for there to be a discretion. I think that is where you are determining a document to comply with a regulatory requirement. You would not want that to be mandatory, because you would want to make sure that a person is considering whether that document should comply with it. And if it should comply, then they've got the discretion to do that. So, I mean, if the Commissioner is doing the right thing, and we operate on the basis that they will, I don't think the issue that you raise is going to be a problem. If the alternative construction of "will," you would still have to have an assessment against criteria, which becomes arguably a more, I suppose, legal type test about, well, I can only do this if this ticks all these boxes. I think what you have here is a discretion. The Commissioner has to have regard to a range of factors, but the government does think it's appropriate for the Commission to have discretion.
Senator Siewert.
Yeah, I wasn't intending to imply the Commission won't do the right thing. I'll just put that on the record. In fact, I'll just also put on the record that, as you articulated earlier, there's been a great deal of faith expressed through this inquiry, all the inquiry process into Ms Pascoe, and very strong support for her as the Commissioner. So I'll just acknowledge that on the record. What organisations are looking for is a commitment from government that in this transition process there will be every endeavour made to reduce red tape and the use of reports as often as possible, so they don't have to keep reporting. And this is not just about the Commission, it's also about government agencies and how the Commission can facilitate that relationship between government agencies and reusing reports as much as possible. So I'm looking for, where's the government up to in terms of meeting those commitments that it's already made to the not-for-profit sector about reducing red tape?
Minister.
Thank you. First, in relation to the specific bill, I understand the Commissioner has given that, well, undertaking might be a strong word, made that clear, the intention. I do want to say to the Senator, we have done quite a lot of work in this area. I don't want to pretend to the Senator nor the Chamber that it is easy to reduce some of the compliance requirements with government because, particularly in a devolved financial management framework, obviously a particular entity might have a grant or an arrangement with 2 or 3 departments or different parts with the same department but with different funding arrangements, and so that obviously creates a compliance burden which is a function of the way government works. So we've been doing a fair bit of work with Minister Butler and Treasury and Finance to try and work through how are some of the ways we can improve arrangements. You might be aware that we announced on the 17th of October that we would implement a report once, use often reporting framework by the ACNC, and that we'd support that with the Commonwealth Grants guidelines. There have also been other arrangements in terms of contract management out of my portfolio, which I'm happy to try and arrange a briefing from. So the intention is there. I don't want to overstate it because having worked in this area for a while, I know it's a lot easier to talk about red tape reduction than actually deliver it. Delivering it requires quite a lot of work, but I think that the bill before you and the commitments that the Commissioner has given really indicates the approach that the government's taking.
Senator Siewert.
I thank the Minister for that explanation, and I think your comment about it does take a while to happen, I think, is the reason for the sector's nervousness. They've heard commitments around red tape reduction before, and it's not that they're questioning the commitment, it's how it's getting done, and in particular the difficulty working across various government agencies and the issue of providing financial reports to one organisation or continue to having to report to individual organisations on individual grants. Is it the government's intent that where an organisation has reported to one agency on a particular government grant, that they could use that same report to be able to report against other grants, if appropriate?
Minister.
Senator, that was what I was referring to in the first part of my earlier answer, that we have announced the implementation of a report once, use often reporting framework, and we've supported that through changes to the Commonwealth Grants guidelines. The Commonwealth Grant guidelines are administered by me, or Finance, and they establish the grants policy and reporting framework for departments and agencies subject to the Financial Management and Accountability Act. So I can give you, I can read all of the effects of that if you... I don't really like tabling these notes per se, but the change will benefit many organisations that will be registered with the ACNC and are recipients of grants from Commonwealth agencies and departments. These changes will state that agency staff should not seek information from grant applicants and grant recipients that is collected by other Commonwealth entities and is available to agency staff. In particular, they will provide that agency staff must not request information already provided to the ACNC by an organisation regulated by it. The changes also state that when determining whether acquittal or reporting requirements are required for a grant, agency staff must have regard to information collected by regulators, such as the ACNC. And the changes will state that if an entity provides an annual audited financial statement to the ACNC, then a grant acquittal should not be required unless the nature of the activity for which the grant has been provided is regarded as high risk. I also am advised, I think I made reference to this, that the ACNC has undertaken to develop and make public a red tape reduction timeline and plan, and the annual report of the Commission to Parliament will also provide details of performance against this timeline.
Senator Siewert.
I have 2 final questions in that particular area, and then I've got one more set of questions, and then I promise I'll finish. I just wanted to pick up on that, the last point about the timeline. Will that include both for that reporting process but also the long-term review of the success of the legislation in terms of red tape reduction, measures that measures on red tape reduction, or what measures are going to be used to work out whether red tape has been reduced? So what indicators, I should say, what indicators are going to be used? Has that been determined, and will you determine some?
Minister.
Not as I understand by government. So I would assume if the obligation is the Commission has undertaken to develop and make public a red tape reduction timeline and plan, that'll be a matter that the Commission will consider what the, I suppose, KPIs are.
Senator Siewert.
Okay, fair enough. I suppose then I should put on record to the Commission that it would be useful for some indicators or KPIs to be developed for that. Can I just you go very quickly to the state federal harmonisation process? I understand that process has started. Could you give us it's an issue that's of a hot topic for the not-for-profit sector and charities. Could you give us a quick update about where that process is up to and how soon you expect it to be completed?
Minister.
The lack of an independent regulator focused on charities and the specific needs and characteristics of the sector has been a hindrance to delivering a national approach to NFP regulation. The government is obviously the government's made a decision to establish a regulator at the Commonwealth level to provide a platform to deliver harmonised and consistent regulation of charities across Australia. The government is working collaboratively with the states and territories through the NFP Reform Working Group established under the Council of Australian Governments. I'm advised that the South Australian Government earlier this month announced that state will make amendments to its incorporated associations and charitable collections legislation to harmonise reporting requirements and authorise charities to collect charitable donations in South Australia once they are formally registered with the Commission. We welcome South Australia's leadership in this regard and look forward to working with other states and territories to deliver similar reform outcomes across Australia. I understand that is also the position that's been expressed by quite a number of entities within the NFP sector.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. There's one question that fits here, or fits in red tape, the issues around red tape reductions. In the meantime, before the harmonisation process is complete, will there be circumstances where the ACNC could accept state reporting, state reports as a substitute or as part of their reporting requirements for ACNC?
Minister.
I'm advised the answer is yes.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. Sorry, either I misunderstood or didn't catch what a possible timeline for completion of the harmonisation process.
Minister.
As you probably will be aware, Senator, what First Ministers do is they agree processes and then they agree a report back date. So that's probably the best timeline to give you, and I understand the reporting back date for this reform is early 2013.
Senator Siewert.
I think the Minister, would that be through a COAG process? Okay.
Minister.
It would be a report from the working group, I assume, to the Council, to First Ministers.
Senator Siewert.
Thank you. That's the end of my questions. I thank the Minister very much. As I indicated earlier, the Greens will be supporting the government amendments. Okay.
The question before the Senate is the amendments on 1 to 23 on AP 218 and amendments 1 to 11 on AP 219 be agreed to. Those of opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question, therefore, is that the bills as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that the bills be reported. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The committee has considered the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profit Commissions Bill 2012 and a related bill and agreed to it with amendments. Minister.
Mr Acting Deputy President, I move that the report of the committee be adopted.
All those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister.
I move that the bill be now read a third time.
Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.